Power is most expensive when a man mistakes possession for permission. The vineyard looked almost holy in the late harvest light, its rows of amber leaves rolling over the hills like a private kingdom stitched in gold. Beyond the stone archway, black cars moved slowly along the gravel drive, their tires whispering over crushed limestone polished by decades of wealth. The air smelled of damp earth, oak barrels, aged Cabernet, and the faint citrus polish used on the tasting terrace before important guests arrived. Julian Pierce believed all of it belonged to him. He stepped out of the lead car in a pale tailored suit, silver hair brushed back, his watch catching the sun with the casual arrogance of a man who had never asked whether a door would open for him. Beside him, Brielle Langford unfolded herself from the passenger seat, blonde, porcelain-skinned, and dressed in cream silk that looked chosen less for beauty than for announcement. She smiled at the vineyard staff as if they had already been instructed to remember her name. They had not. At the far end of the terrace, Amara Voss stood beside a table laid with crystal glasses, linen napkins, and 3 unopened bottles from the estate reserve. She wore deep burgundy, not bright enough to beg for attention, but rich enough to make the late sun seem to gather around her. In one hand, she held a slim cream folder marked only by a faint legal seal and a ribbon of unreadable embossed text. She did not move toward them. The terrace was full enough to make the insult public, but quiet enough to make every pause audible. A senior distributor from San Francisco stood near the stone balustrade, speaking softly about allocation rights and restaurant lists. 2 investors murmured about vineyard acreage, water access, and whether the Pierce label might expand into a luxury hospitality group. Somewhere behind the tasting room doors, a cork released with a muted pop, followed by the delicate chime of crystal being arranged for people who measured status by what was poured before anyone asked. Wealth had its own weather. Julian crossed the terrace with Brielle on his arm, not hiding her, not explaining her, not even pretending the gesture required shame. He greeted the guests with the warmth of a host and the calculation of a man staging a transition. When his eyes passed over Amara, they did not soften. That was the first cruelty. Brielle let her fingers trail along the back of the carved walnut chair at the center of the table, the one reserved for the estate's principal representative during private tastings. Julian noticed. He smiled as though rewarding good instinct. "Sit there," he said, lightly, before anyone else could speak. The staff froze for only a second, but in rooms built on hierarchy, a second can sound like a verdict. Amara watched Brielle lower herself into the chair as if it had been waiting for her all along. She did not blink. Julian lifted a glass from the tray and turned to the small circle of guests, his voice smooth, expensive, and careless. He spoke of modernization, expansion, a new reserve line, and fresh vision, with Brielle glowing beside him like a purchase he wanted mistaken for a partner. Then he added, almost gently, "Amara doesn't involve herself in these decisions anymore." The sentence landed softer than a slap and cut deeper because of it. No one laughed. Amara placed the cream folder on the table beside her untouched glass of wine. The paper made almost no sound. Yet the senior distributor looked down at it, and for the first time that afternoon, his expression changed. Julian did not notice. He was still looking at the vineyard, at the guests, at the woman in the wrong chair, imagining a kingdom he could give away because he had never understood who owned the ground beneath it. The silence after Julian's remark was not empty. It was filled with calculations. The senior distributor lowered his glass half an inch, a nearly invisible movement that only people accustomed to private rooms and expensive mistakes would understand. A vineyard manager near the terrace doors shifted his weight, eyes moving from Julian to Amara, then to the cream folder resting beside the untouched wine. Amara gave him no signal. Julian mistook the room's restraint for obedience and continued speaking as though he had just cleared away an inconvenience. He described a future tasting pavilion, a members-only harvest dinner series, a reserve collection with a younger face attached to it, and every sentence placed Brielle closer to the center of the estate. His voice carried smoothly over the terrace, polished by years of boardrooms, interviews, and men laughing before they knew whether something was funny. Brielle leaned into the attention with practiced ease. She wanted witnesses. "I've always thought old estates need a softer touch," she said, turning the reserve bottle slightly so the label faced her. "Something less severe." more inviting. The word severe floated toward Amara like perfume sprayed over a blade. Julian smiled. Exactly. The estate needs someone who understands how to make tradition feel desirable again. One of the investors looked away. That was the second cruelty. Brielle reached for the pen placed beside the tasting notes and drew a lazy circle around the proposed name of the new reserve line. The pen was heavy, black lacquer, used for contracts rather than decoration, and her hand held it with the confidence of someone who had never paid for what she was about to change. She glanced at Julian, waiting for permission that should not have been his to give. He gave it anyway. Go ahead, he said. I trust your taste. Amara looked at the pen, not at Brielle. That line is registered. Her voice was low enough that no one could call it a challenge, but clear enough that everyone heard the correction. Brielle's smile tightened. Julian gave a small laugh, the kind rich men use when facts arrive before they are ready to receive them. Registered under the company, darling. There's no need to make this procedural. Amara lifted her eyes to him. Not that company. The terrace changed again. A crystal glass touched marble somewhere behind Julian, too softly to be an accident and too sharp to be ignored. The vineyard manager's jaw set, as if a truth he had been holding in his mouth had finally been spoken by someone with the right to say it. Brielle withdrew the pen a fraction. Julian did not. He hated being corrected in front of people who sent wire transfers. So he softened his face and sharpened his meaning. Amara has always been sentimental about paperwork, he said to the guests, turning private disrespect into public amusement. She protected the old structure when I wanted to build something larger. He raised his glass toward the hills as if the vines themselves belonged to his ambition. But this estate cannot live in the past forever. Amara touched the edge of the cream folder with 2 fingers. It won't. That was all she gave him. The shortness unsettled Brielle more than anger would have. Anger could be called jealousy, pain could be called weakness, but this kind of calm had no useful name. Julian moved closer to the center chair and rested a hand on its carved back, near Brielle's shoulder, claiming both the woman and the symbol at once. He told the distributor that future allocation decisions would go through him directly, that hospitality expansion would begin before winter, and that certain domestic complications had already been resolved. No one asked what he meant. Everyone understood. A young server approached with the first pour of reserve Cabernet, hands steady but eyes careful. She served Julian, then Brielle, then hesitated before Amara's empty glass. Julian noticed and smiled. Amara won't be tasting today. Amara looked at the server. Pour it. 2 words. The server obeyed. The wine entered the glass in a dark red ribbon, rich and silent, carrying the smell of oak, black cherry, wet soil, and a harvest Julian had praised but never labored to save. Brielle watched the pour as if it had become an act of defiance. Julian's smile thinned. Amara lifted the glass, but did not drink. Announce what you own, she said, not what you borrowed. The terrace went still enough for the wind through the vines to sound like whispering. Julian's eyes narrowed for the first time that afternoon, not with fear, but with the irritation of a man hearing language he could not immediately dominate. He set his glass down beside the reserve bottle, carefully enough to preserve dignity, though the stem clicked against marble with a little too much force. Around him, the terrace remained beautiful in that cruel way expensive places can remain beautiful while people inside them begin to fracture. Beauty did not take sides. Borrowed, Julian repeated, smiling toward the guests as if Amara had made a charming error. That is a dramatic word for a family asset. He turned slightly, offering the room the version of himself he trusted most. Generous, reasonable, slightly wounded by a difficult wife. Brielle relaxed when she saw it, because she had mistaken performance for control. Amara said nothing. Years earlier, when Julian had nearly drowned the estate in expansion debt, he had called it vision. He had wanted a luxury lodge above the Western Ridge, a private members club by the Old Barrel House, a celebrity harvest weekend where the wine would become background decoration for cameras and gold bracelets. Banks had smiled at him, consultants had flattered him, and every risk had arrived wrapped in the language of growth. Then the ground shifted. A bad acquisition closed late, a hotel partner withdrew, and 3 bridge loans came due within the same quarter. Julian had flown to meetings, given interviews, and spoken about legacy while invoices sat unpaid under polished paperweights. Amara had read everything. She had sat in quiet offices after midnight with estate maps spread across the table, not because she loved paperwork, but because she understood that land could be lost by men who only loved applause. She had separated the vines from the vanity, the label from the lifestyle, the seller from the debt. She saved the roots. Julian remembered none of it that way. In his memory, crisis had been weather, and recovery had been proof of his genius. He remembered signing documents because Amara placed them in front of him with neat tabs and calm explanations he barely heard. He remembered joking that legal language existed to make ordinary things feel important. He had signed anyway. That was his habit. Now the same habit stood behind him like a closed door. Brielle touched the black lacquer pen again, trying to reclaim the mood. "Surely the important thing is what Julian wants the estate to become," she said, her voice soft but edged with ownership she had not earned. A few guests looked at their glasses. One investor studied the horizon as if the vines had suddenly become fascinating. The senior distributor did not look away from Amara. Julian seized the opening. "Exactly," he said. "This place survived because I refused to let it stay small." Amara looked at the rows of vines descending toward the lower valley, where the oldest Cabernet block had survived frost, drought, and one man's vanity. It survived despite that. For words, Julian's face hardened, but he still did not understand the danger. He thought Amara was speaking emotionally, trying to wound him in the only language he believed wives used when they lost their place. He did not hear the legal truth beneath the sentence. Brielle heard only disrespect toward the man she needed powerful. "That seems unfair," she said, lifting her chin. "He built all of this." The vineyard manager looked down. The young server stopped breathing for half a second. Amara turned her glass slowly by the stem, watching the dark wine catch the late light like blood held inside crystal. He branded it. The distinction landed with surgical calm. Julian gave a low laugh, though no one joined him. "You see," he said, spreading one hand toward the guests. "This is why I prefer to keep business decisions with people who understand scale." He moved behind Brielle's chair again, placing himself in the frame he wanted everyone to remember. The billionaire, the blonde woman, the vineyard, the future. But the cream folder remained on the table, small and quiet, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Inside it were copies of the land trust amendments, the collateral release, the label assignment, and the final transfer documents filed that morning. Inside it was the history Julian had signed and never respected. Inside it was the answer to a question he had been too proud to ask. Amara rested her hand on the folder at last. "Scale is not ownership." The sentence emptied the terrace of pretense. Somewhere beyond the stone wall, wind passed through the vines in a long, dry hush. Julian looked at the folder, then at Amara, and for the first time his confidence paused before it reached his mouth. Julian recovered by reaching for charm, because charm had rescued him from smaller rooms and weaker truths. He gave the terrace a patient smile, lifted his glass again, and let the ruby wine circle once inside the crystal, as if he were considering flavor rather than control. The guests understood the gesture, because men like Julian often used elegance to cover the sound of a door closing behind them. Brielle understood only the surface. "I think the reserve name should feel warmer," she said, tapping the tasting notes with one manicured finger. "Less severe, more romantic, something people want to be seen drinking." Her eyes moved toward Amara on the word severe. Julian did not correct her. That was the third cruelty. Brielle leaned back in the carved walnut chair, crossing one pale leg over the other, letting the posture announce what her words had not yet dared to say. She asked the vineyard manager whether the old guest house had a private terrace, whether the cellar dinners could be redesigned with softer lighting, whether the portrait wall inside the tasting hall could be updated because some traditions made a place feel closed. Each question was delivered like a suggestion. Each suggestion was an erasure. The manager answered carefully, never saying yes without looking toward Amara first. Julian noticed and disliked it. "You can answer Miss Langford directly," he said. "She'll be involved in the next phase." The manager's face remained professional, but his hands tightened around the leather service book. "Of course, Mr. Pierce." He did not move. Brielle smiled at the small victory and reached for the seller access registry lying near the reserve notes, its cream pages filled with embossed names, allocation numbers, and private tasting privileges. She flipped it open as if opening a menu. The sound was delicate. The insult was not. There are so many old names here, she said. Do they all still matter? Julian glanced at Amara, wanting that question to bruise. Some names remain out of courtesy longer than necessity. Amara looked at the registry. Not courtesy. Brielle paused, her finger resting near the column marked Principal Access. Julian's smile sharpened, but his eyes showed impatience now. Then what would you call it? Amara met his gaze. Control. One word. It stood between them more firmly than any argument. The senior distributor shifted again, this time turning his body slightly toward Amara, the way people turn toward the person who actually holds the answer. Julian saw it and felt the room tilt a fraction away from him. He hated fractions, so he reached for volume without raising his voice, expanding his gestures, warming his tone, making the insult feel like hospitality. He told Brielle that the Western guest house would suit her taste, that the cellar dinner menu could be revised, that the next reserve release needed a woman's eye, but not Amara's kind of woman's eye. A few guests stared into their glasses. One investor stopped taking notes. The young server disappeared through the tasting room doors and returned without the second bottle Julian had requested. Julian frowned. I asked for the 2009 Hillside Reserve. The server held the tray closer to her waist. The cellar team is confirming access. Brielle let out a small laugh. Access to wine in his own estate. She meant it as flirtation, but the sentence landed with the ugly innocence of someone who had walked into a house built on documents she could not read. Amara looked toward the closed cellar doors beyond the terrace. They should confirm. Brielle's smile faded. Julian placed his palm flat on the back of her chair, claiming the moment by force of posture. Bring the bottle, he said, each word smooth and dangerous. The server did not move. She looked past him, not to Brielle, not to the investors, to Amara. Julian's jaw tightened. Amara gave the smallest nod. Wait. The server stepped back. The entire terrace felt it then, the difference between being obeyed because people feared your money and being obeyed because the structure itself recognized your authority. Brielle removed her hand from the registry. Julian slowly lowered his glass. For the first time, the woman in the wrong chair looked less like a future mistress of the estate and more like a guest who had chosen the wrong table. Amara touched the cream folder, but she did not open it. Not yet. The pause lasted long enough for everyone on the terrace to understand that something larger than a delayed wine bottle had entered the afternoon. Julian stood behind Brielle's chair with one hand still resting on the carved walnut, but the gesture no longer looked protective or powerful. It looked staged, and staged things become fragile the moment the audience stops believing. Then Graham Reddick arrived. He came through the tasting room doors without announcement, a tall older man in a charcoal suit, silver hair neatly combed, his expression calm in the way only legal men become calm after decades of watching arrogant people discover paper has weight. In his left hand was a narrow leather portfolio, not thick enough to impress the careless and not thin enough to be ignored by anyone intelligent. Two estate managers straightened when they saw him. Julian noticed that first. Graham stopped at the edge of the terrace, inclined his head to Amara, then to the guests, then finally to Julian with a politeness so measured it felt like a locked gate. The senior distributor's face changed at once, recognition crossing it before he could disguise it. One of the investors whispered Graham's name under his breath. Brielle looked from face to face, annoyed by a silence she had not been taught how to read. Is this another staff issue? She asked softly, though not softly enough. No one answered her. Graham placed the leather portfolio on the table beside the cream folder and the untouched registry. The sound was quiet. It rearranged the room. Julian gave a laugh that arrived half a second late. Graham, this is a private tasting. Graham looked at him with professional patience. Not under your authority. 3 words, clean and bloodless. The terrace seemed to inhale and then refused to breathe out. Julian's hand slipped from the back of Brielle's chair, but only for an instant before he placed it there again, more firmly, as if furniture could still prove dominion. Careful, he said, keeping his smile for the witnesses. You represent administrative interests, not ownership. Graham opened the portfolio and removed a single document with a pale blue certification tab. I represent the trust. Julian's smile remained, but the skin around it tightened. Brielle shifted in the chair, suddenly aware that she was seated at the center of a conversation she did not understand. Amara stood beside the table, her burgundy dress still catching the last warmth of sun, her face composed, her hand resting lightly near the stem of her glass. She did not look surprised. She looked finished. Graham turned one page, then another, the paper moving with dry precision in the Vineyard air. He confirmed the time of filing, the approval of the transfer, the authority of the land trust, and the suspension of all discretionary hospitality privileges pending the new operating structure. Each phrase was formal, almost dull. Each phrase removed something from Julian. The young server lowered her eyes. The Vineyard manager closed the service book. The distributor set his glass down entirely. Julian heard the legal language, but beneath it he heard the real sentence. Not yours. Betrayal tried to smile again, but there was no one left to receive it. Julian, she said, making his name sound like a request. He ignored her. This is absurd, he said to Graham. My name is on the label. Amara looked at him then. A label is not land. The words were soft enough to spare him theatrics and sharp enough to leave him nowhere to hide. Graham slid the certified document across the table, stopping it just short of Julian's glass. Mrs. Voss retained controlling authority over the Vineyard land, the cellar registry, and the heritage label assignment. The final estate transfer was completed this afternoon. Julian stared at the page as if the text might rearrange itself under pressure. It did not. The terrace was full of expensive wine, polished stone, late sunlight, and people who now understood that the man performing ownership had been standing on permission. Amara lifted her glass at last, not in celebration, not in mockery, but with the calm dignity of a woman who had waited until truth could speak without raising its voice. Continue, she said. Graham nodded, and the estate obeyed. Graham continued without drama, because drama belonged to people who needed volume to replace authority. He read from the certified page in the same tone a man might use to confirm a meeting time, and that made every sentence more devastating. The vineyard remained golden behind him, the hills glowing with late harvest light, the rows of vines still and orderly as if nature itself had decided to witness the correction of a lie. Julian stopped smiling. The controlling land parcel, Graham said, was transferred out of Pierce Hospitality Holdings 7 years ago under emergency preservation terms. He turned the page with one precise movement. The cellar assets were separated from the hospitality division 3 months later. He glanced once at Amara, then back to Julian. The heritage label assignment was never individually held by you. That was the first door closing. Betrayal's fingers left the carved armrest as if the chair had become less safe beneath her. Julian looked from Graham to the distributor, then to the investors, searching for someone willing to treat this as a misunderstanding. No one stepped forward. Money respected ownership more than ego. That is a technical structure, Julian said, forcing the words through a jaw that had begun to tighten. Created for tax efficiency and liability shielding. Nothing more. Graham did not argue. He simply placed another document beside the first, its pale seal catching the light. It became operational authority at 4 p.m. The senior distributor inhaled quietly through his nose, the sound of a man revising every future conversation at once. Julian reached for the paper, but Graham did not release it until Amara gave a small nod. Only then did the document slide fully across the marble. Permission had changed hands in public. Betrayal stood halfway, then sat again, trapped between wanting to support Julian and not wanting to be photographed beside a collapse. Julian, tell them, she whispered. Tell them this is just legal wording. He did not answer her. He was reading now. For perhaps the first time in years, Julian Pierce read a document because the room no longer allowed him to ignore it. The words did not flatter him. The land trust named Amara as controlling signatory. The bonded seller registry named Amara as final access authority. The heritage label assignment placed approval power outside his personal reach, including reserve releases, allocation lists, and distributor approvals. The estate sale confirmation appeared at the bottom with a timestamp that made his afternoon performance look almost obscene. He had brought Betrayal into a kingdom already sold. Amara watched him reach the timestamp. She said nothing. Julian's face changed slowly, not into regret, not yet, but into the stunned anger of a man discovering that the floor had been removed while the chandelier still shone above him. He pushed the document back with 2 fingers, as if rejecting paper could reverse filing. You cannot sell family ground without me. Amara's eyes did not harden. Never yours alone. 3 words. They did what a courtroom speech could not. Graham added, the trust documents bear your signature, Mr. Pierce. A small, terrible silence followed. Julian looked up sharply. I signed preservation documents. Graham's voice stayed level. You signed controlling amendments. Another door closed. Betrayal turned toward Julian with the first unguarded doubt of the afternoon, and that doubt wounded him more visibly than Amara's composure. The investors saw it. The distributor saw it. Even the server standing near the terrace doors saw the exact moment Julian realized his mistress had been promised privileges he did not possess. Amara lifted the reserve glass to her lips and took the smallest sip, calm, measured, unhurried. It was not victory. It was release. Julian stared at her as if anger might summon the woman he preferred, the one who would explain too much, plead too softly, and make his cruelty feel complicated. She did not appear. Graham closed the portfolio. Effective immediately, all hospitality, cellar, and label decisions transfer to the new estate authority. Julian gripped the edge of the table. And who controls that authority? The question arrived late. Amara set down her glass. I do. The vineyard wind moved through the terrace, touching the linen, the registry, the documents, and the woman in the wrong chair. Betrayal finally stood. No one stopped her. Julian did not look at her, because the empire he had used to impress her was being taken from him one signed page at a time. The first privilege disappeared so politely that Julian almost missed it. The vineyard manager stepped forward with the leather service book held against his chest, his face respectful, his voice low, and his loyalty already transferred to the authority that could sign his payroll and protect the land. He asked for Julian's cellar access, credentialed the way a hotel might ask for a room key after checkout. That was the beginning. Julian stared at him as if the man had spoken in another language. For years, employees had moved before Julian finished asking. They poured before he lifted a finger. They opened doors before he reached them and treated his impatience as a form of importance. Now the manager stood still. Julian laughed once, sharp and humorless. You are not seriously asking me for access to my own cellar. The manager did not flinch. The registry has changed, sir. Betrayal looked toward the tasting room doors, then toward the gravel drive, suddenly interested in exits rather than estates. Graham remained beside the table, neither rescuing Julian from humiliation nor embellishing it. Amara stood with one hand near the cream folder, her expression calm enough to feel merciless only to those who had mistaken her restraint for weakness. Julian turned to her. Tell him to stop. Amara looked at the manager. Proceed. One word. The manager placed a small silver tray on the marble table, and Julian understood that the request had become a record. He reached into his jacket, withdrew the black credential card, and held it for a second longer than necessary, as if ownership might return through hesitation. It did not. The card touched the tray with a flat, final sound. Betrayal's face changed when she heard it. The second privilege vanished before the first had settled. The events director approached next, a woman in a navy dress with a tablet held neatly in both hands, and informed Graham that the reserve launch under Julian's guest list had been suspended. The guest list. The private chef. The chamber quartet scheduled for the barrel room. The allocation dinner for top buyers. The photographers hired to capture a future Julian had already lost. All paused. Julian's mouth tightened. Those contracts are under my office. Graham turned a page. They were contingent on estate authorization. Amara added, revoked. The word fell cleanly, without pleasure. A senior investor slipped his phone from his pocket and typed a message under the table. The distributor stepped aside to make a quiet call, already repositioning his company away from Julian and toward the new authority. 2 guests who had spent the afternoon laughing at Julian's small jokes now studied the documents as if silence could erase their earlier loyalty. It could not. The room was changing sides without standing up. Betrayal finally moved away from the central chair. She did it slowly, pretending to admire the view, pretending the vines had called her to the balustrade, pretending she had not just been removed by gravity itself. No one asked her to sit back down. That was worse. Julian saw it and felt the wound open wider. She had been useful as proof of his power, but now her distance proved its absence. The young server returned carrying not the 2009 Hillside Reserve, but a simple glass of water for Betrayal and a fresh linen for Amara. The hierarchy could not have been clearer if it had been engraved in stone. Julian's eyes followed the server. "Where is the bottle?" The server looked to the manager, and the manager looked to Graham. Graham answered, "Private cellar release requires Mrs. Voss's approval." Julian's head turned slowly. Amara did not make him wait long. Denied. One word. No anger. No explanation. Just the closing of a door he had assumed would open because he was near it. Brielle set her water down untouched. The investor who had been texting placed his phone away and addressed Amara directly for the first time, asking whether the new estate authority intended to preserve existing distribution agreements. Julian's face darkened at the sound of business moving around him. Amara gave a brief nod. Stable partners remain. The distributor heard the distinction and understood he had been spared because he had not overplayed his loyalty to Julian. Julian understood the other half. Unstable men did not. The tasting terrace, once arranged as his stage, had become a courtroom without a judge, a boardroom without a vote, a funeral without flowers. Every courtesy remained intact. Every privilege did not. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge, Julian still stood in the center of the terrace, dressed like a king, surrounded by people who had stopped treating him as one. Julian did not leave the terrace because leaving would have looked like defeat, and staying had begun to feel like imprisonment. He looked from Amara to Graham, from Graham to the cellar doors, and found the last piece of theater he believed could still save him. The private cellar had always been his favorite proof, a cool underground chamber lined with bottles no guest could touch unless he allowed it. He turned toward it. "Open the cellar," he said. No one moved at first. Then Graham gathered the documents. Amara lifted the cream folder, and the manager led them through the tasting room into the stone corridor below. Brielle followed at a distance, no longer beside Julian, no longer touching his arm, her cream silk dress looking too bright beneath the low amber lights. The air changed as they descended, growing colder, scented with oak, cork, dust, old stone, and wine sleeping behind iron gates. Their footsteps echoed along the narrow passage. Each step stripped away the music of the terrace, the polite murmurs, the false warmth, and the fragile performance Julian had built around himself. Wealth sounded different underground. Down here, there were no investors to flatter him and no sunlight to polish his expression. There was only the cellar door, black steel framed by limestone, with a small access panel glowing beside it. Julian stepped to the panel before anyone asked. He entered the private code he had used for years, each digit pressed with the confidence of a man who believed memory could substitute for authority. Brielle saw the old certainty return to his face and straightened slightly, hope returning to her like bad lighting. Julian noticed. He needed her to see him win something. The panel flashed red. He tried again, slower, as if authority might respond better to patience. Red again. The sound was small, electronic, and absolute. Julian's face tightened. The system is malfunctioning. Graham's eyes moved to the panel, then to the manager. The manager checked his tablet without drama. The system is current. Julian pressed the same code one last time, harder now, as if force could make the old world recognize him. The panel rejected him. Again, Brielle's hope drained in silence. Amara stood a few feet away, the cream folder held calmly against her side, her posture unchanged, her eyes not cruel, not soft, simply present for the truth Julian had insisted on staging. He turned toward her, anger finally breaking through the polished surface. "You locked me out." Amara answered, "No," one word. He stared at her. She let the silence make him ask the question he should have asked years earlier. Graham spoke then, his voice carrying cleanly through the cellar corridor. "Mr. Pierce, your access ended at 4 p.m. The sentence settled into the stone. Julian looked back at the door as if it had betrayed him personally, but doors only obey the people named in the right documents. He raised his hand, then lowered it, unable to decide whether to strike the panel, argue with Graham, or plead with Amara in front of the woman he had brought to replace her. None of those choices restored him. Brielle stepped back once. The heel of her shoe clicked against the stone, and Julian heard it like abandonment. Amara moved past him toward the access panel, not close enough to touch him, not far enough to seem afraid. The manager held out the authorized credential on a small tray. She did not take it immediately. She looked at Julian, and for one brief second he saw not revenge, but distance. Protected now. Her voice was quiet. The card touched her fingers. The panel flashed green. The lock released with a deep mechanical sound, and the cellar door opened for her without hesitation. The cellar door opened into a room Julian had once treated like a throne chamber. Rows of dark bottles slept behind brass rails, their labels turned outward with museum precision, each vintage carrying a season, a harvest, a risk, a recovery he had never fully understood. Cold air rolled over the stone floor and touched his face like a verdict. Amara stepped inside first. The manager followed at a respectful distance. Then Graham. Then the silence that had become more powerful than any guest list Julian had ever controlled. Brielle remained outside the threshold. She no longer looked like a woman waiting to be invited deeper into luxury. She looked like someone realizing luxury had mistaken her for an intruder. Julian forced himself forward, but the manager's hand rose slightly, not blocking him with aggression, only with procedure. Authorized personnel only, sir. Sir. The word had never sounded smaller. Julian's eyes burned as he looked past him at Amara, standing beside the oldest reserve wall, the place where he had once brought investors, celebrities, and men who praised his taste while drinking wine protected by someone else's discipline. "You're enjoying this," he said, because accusing her of cruelty was easier than admitting he had mistaken her dignity for weakness. Amara turned slowly. Her face held no triumph. No, one word, and it denied him even the comfort of being hated. Graham handed her the final acknowledgement sheet, and she signed with a calm, steady hand. The black lacquer pen moved once across the page, not like a weapon, not like theater, but like a door being closed from the inside. Julian watched the signature land. He looked older now, not because years had passed, but because illusion had. "I gave you this life," he said, his voice lower, rougher, stripped of the audience-friendly polish. Brielle looked down at the floor. Graham did not move. The manager did not blink. Amara placed the pen back on the document tray and walked toward Julian until only the threshold separated them. Behind her, the cellar lights glowed over rows of bottles he could no longer touch. Behind him, Brielle stood near the corridor wall, already emotionally gone, her silence no longer loyalty but self-preservation. Amara looked at the man who had brought another woman into her preserved ground and called it power. Then she gave him the sentence he would carry longer than the loss itself. "You never owned this life, Julian. I only let you stand in it." The words did not echo loudly, but they reached every stone in the corridor. Julian opened his mouth and found nothing worthy of the room. Amara stepped past him without brushing his sleeve, walked up the cellar stairs, and emerged into the last amber light of the vineyard. The terrace had emptied into quiet order. Contracts were being collected. Staff were returning glasses to trays. The old reserve bottle remained unopened, no longer a symbol of his taste, but of his exclusion. Outside, the gravel drive curved between rows of vines turning dark against the sunset. Amara crossed it alone, cream folder tucked beneath one arm, burgundy dress moving softly in the evening wind. She did not look back when Brielle's car pulled away. She did not look back when Julian called her name once from the terrace. The estate would remain protected. The harvest crews would remain paid. The water rights would remain intact, and the reserve allocation would stay with stable partners. Julian would stand outside its locked doors, learning the difference between being seen and being sovereign. By the time Amara reached the gate, the vineyard lights had come on behind her, warm and distant, like a kingdom finally free of the man who mistook permission for power. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.